Hello, and welcome to the Making Retirement Make Sense case study series, where we walk you through real financial plans and show you how the experts approach retirement's biggest decisions. Today, we're talking about what's called the superhero account in retirement, and it is not a Roth IRA. Instead, we're going to be talking about health savings accounts. I'm your host, CJ Miller, joined today by partner and retirement income planning expert, Amy Shepard. Amy, how are you?
I'm great, CJ. How are you?
Good. So why is the HSA the superhero account?
Triple tax advantage. That's the lingo. So you get a tax deduction when you put money in. The investments in the account grow tax deferred, and you can then also take withdrawals tax free, assuming they're for qualified medical expenses. So
now these accounts are incredibly versatile because not only are they strategic, meaning it makes sense to take advantage, systematically year after year of these accounts, but they can also be very tactical. And so today we're going to walk through some cases of not just should you contribute or not, but how do you actually use it when you approach retirement? Because there are a lot of different ways where they can come in handy in terms of specific use cases.
Yeah, I thought today we could talk about, kind of what they are. We just went over that briefly, but how to fund them. And then most importantly, for what our perspective as retirement planners, how does it fit into an overall retirement plan? When should you start taking from it? How should you consider it as, one of the buckets you have available to help fund your retirement?
Great. Well, let's get started on some of the basics. So what are the requirements to contribute to an HSA?
Most important is that you have to have an HSA eligible plan. So generally, it's a high deductible health plan, and it will say, usually in the name of the plan, HSA eligible. But that's the key. You have to have an HSA eligible plan to be able to fund an HSA.
And so for many people, the HSA eligibility, a lot of the time you'll actually pay less in premiums to get the HSA eligible plan, but that also is accompanied with a high deductible. And so, even though for a lot of people the HSA can make sense, there are cases where, paying the higher premium can and you'd be excluded. But for those with the high deductible plans, how should they approach funding the account? Tell us about some of the practicalities to consider.
Yeah, so I think, one thing you said I have to poke a little fun at is theoretically with an HSA eligible plan, you have lower premiums. That's how it seemed when HSAs first came out. In the current state, it feels like the premiums are still high, but having an HSA can be really beneficial. So I would say general rule of thumb is people who use HSA eligible plans generally treat insurance as more of like health insurance as more catastrophe coverage. They don't have chronic medical conditions. They don't routinely use their health insurance. And so a high deductible plan, theoretically, you have lower premiums, and then you have the option to fund your HSA to help offset, future medical costs or, the higher deductible that the plan comes with. So we'll start there. Anything to add before we jump in?
No, I think that's a really great point. And then as far as contribution limits, so we're filming this in 2026, which means you could still contribute for 2025 or you have the 2026 calendar year. We'll just throw up on the screen what the limits are currently. And then if you're over 55, which is different than the Roth IRA contributions or pre-tax IRA catch-up, it's 55 is the age, you get an extra $1,000 as well. Is that right?
So yes, the funding, options, it's going to depend. You can put in more if you're on family coverage, if you have an individual health insurance plan that's HSA eligible, lower contribution limits.
All right. Well, let's dive in. What do you have prepared for us today?
Yeah. So what I thought we would talk about first is, hopefully most of our viewers and listeners have seen, the Excel model that we use to build out comprehensive financial plans. That's what I have up on the screen right now. And it's showing a section within the plan where the withdrawals are mapped out. And what I want to show is that our case study today, our clients are Dino and Dina. I like to name my sample clients after things my kids make me think of, and I have an 8-year-old who loves dinosaurs, so this is a nod to him. Dina and Dino are in 63 this year in 2026, so they're not yet on Medicare. That's a really important point. I'm just going to mention that once you are on Medicare, there are no Medicare plans that are HSA eligible at the current time. So once you switch to Medicare, HSA contributions are no longer a thing. You can use an HSA account that you've built up in prior years. But again, once you switch to Medicare, you can no longer fund your HSA.
Now, this is a really important caveat. So when I asked you previously about, what are the qualifications, you did not mention earned income. All you said is you have to have a high deductible HSA eligible plan. And so for anybody that retires before 65, oftentimes you will be able to continue contributing to the HSA so long as your plan is eligible. You do not have an earned income requirement. And that's really important. And then the other aspect that you mentioned, right? When's the deadline? Like, when can you really stop in your plan? It is Medicare. One caveat I like to bring up is that you have to be really careful about when you enroll in Medicare. Especially if you work after 65. And so occasionally we'll have people that are allowed to defer Medicare without any penalty. And so they continue working, let's say till 70, and they get a qualified special enrollment when they retire where they can enroll in Medicare Part A and B. What a lot of people don't know is that Medicare Part A will have a 6-month retroactive period. And so if you plan on making like half a year's contribution, and you retire in July, a lot of the time you're not going to be able to make that half-year contribution, even if you're not on Part B until July. And so that's a really important caveat for people to consider, as well as how those pro rata situations work when you are over 65.
Yep, nothing is easy. There's so many little nuances to be aware of. The case study we're looking at today that is a little more straightforward in the sense that both of these clients are not Medicare age yet. So they're 63 in 2026. They have 2026 and 2027 to make maximum HSA contributions. And then what you see on the screen is in 2028, both of them turn 65. And so essentially they have all of 2028 until the month they turn 65 to make a proportionate catch-up contribution. Catch-up contribution is the special, $1,000 that you can contribute once you're age 55 or older, and then they also can fund, a proportionate amount of their family maximum as well.
Right. And so you're 100% right on the proration. There is one kind of hidden deposit that you can make if you're married and you're both over 55. And many people miss this, but you're actually allowed to open up an HSA for your spouse as well, the one that is not kind of the primary holder of the typical HSA. And then you can actually do their $1,000 catch-up additional. And so for many people, they're only doing the family max plus $1,000 for, the catch-up, but you can actually get another $1,000 in if you want to put in the legwork of opening a whole separate HSA for the spouse.
Yeah, I will say, most of my clients, if they have a few years before Medicare kicks in, we do recommend that they take the extra 5 minutes it takes to open an HSA online for the second spouse because of the extra $1,000. The catch-up contribution, each catch-up contribution has to go to the individual spouse's HSA. And so like I've had an example where someone is turning 65, next year. They have 1 year. They're like, do I really want to go through the trouble of opening this account, putting the $1,000 in, and then I can't fund it anymore? I think it depends. I would say, sure, just do it. In that case, maybe you open it, you put $1,000 in, and you just spend that money so you don't have an extra account out there to keep track of. But that's not what we're going to talk about today.
Well, that is a really good point, though, Amy. I mean, there's what's financially optimal on paper, and then there's what's realistic.
Right.
And a lot of your retirement's more about behavior. And so like the cost of your time is pretty important. Getting an extra $1,000 in, again, even if it's in your best interest, you have to decide, is it worth your time?
I talk about that a lot in our video, CJ, but there's, the math and then there's the emotion. That's just another example. The math says you should probably do it, but emotion says, you know what, I'm going to spend that extra, 10 minutes of my time going for a walk or going on vacation or planning something more exciting than HSA contributions.
So, Amy, in this example that you have, I do not see any employer deposits, but for people out there that are contributing to HSAs or they're considering doing so and their employer matches, how does that impact the contribution?
It's a really important point. So the family or individual maximum is the maximum amount is a combination of employee and employer contributions. In this case, these clients are retired, so there is no company contribution to their HSA. They're funding the full amount out of pocket. Yeah, I'm glad you asked about that. And I'm also noticing my math since we've been talking that I did only include a catch-up contribution in 2028. And so actually they would be able to fund more than what's on the screen. They'd be able to fund a proportionate amount of the family max plus a proportionate amount of each catch-up contribution.
Exactly, which is why you should also do a tax projection each year, like a previous case study that we've done, to make sure that you're not missing out on those opportunities because of, a typo in a spreadsheet or something.
Yeah.
This is very big picture, but you also need to be able to look tactically year by year for these opportunities.
Yes, I agree. And I love HSAs because they're one of those things that if you forgot to do it in the calendar year, you can do it up until the April tax deadline. You mentioned that when we first started. So
yeah, it's actually better, I think, for people that are like starting to approach ineligibility to wait, because you might not know how many months you're eligible. Like, so if you're in a position where you're not sure what month you're going to retire and enroll in Medicare, for instance, that makes a really big difference.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of awareness on funding HSAs in general. I think a lot of people know what they are. They know their accounts for medical, medical expenses. But I think where there's some opportunity for people to really be strategic is to talk about, okay, great, I funded this account. Now what? And so what I wanted to talk about today, I guess two primary points are, one, what to do with the money that's in an HSA. Do you leave it in cash? No, that's usually not the best solution. So we'll talk about how to invest that money. But then really important is, when do you start using the money in the HSA? So I will say general rule of thumb is, the recommendation for HSAs is you put the money in, you pay any medical expenses out of pocket, and you leave your HSA to grow, assuming you have the means to do that. That's what we talk about with most of our clients. So they get the money in their HSA, and then our recommendation is to invest it fairly aggressively. Before I talk about that, anything to add to those 2 points I made, CJ, about what to do with it in there and then when to take it out?
Well, and just to clarify, when you say pay something out of pocket, you mean from a different account, like a non-retirement brokerage account or an
cash,
IRA,
just
or
checking account,
any other account source that you have to preserve that HSA in that triple tax advantage. Because remember, the growth is also tax-free.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Yep. So this case study, they're 63 this year. What I would recommend to them is, hey, let's continue to fund the HSA while you're eligible, but then the pot of money you already have in there and the contributions you're going to make over the next few years, those should be invested aggressively. I mean, I usually recommend to my clients that they invest their HSA 100% in equities, with a plan that if any surprise medical expense comes up, they're going to tap into their emergency savings account, a high yield savings account, cash in their checking account to cover medical expenses. And then because of that, because of the tax benefits of the HSA, we want to invest it aggressively to give it the best chance to grow, in the future. Kind of along those lines, general rule of thumb that I look at is the idea that we are going to plan to start tapping into the HSA sometime in somebody's mid-70s. So like many of the videos we've done, CJ, we talk about there's the plan on paper and then there's real life. Sometimes real life warrants a change to that approach. But to be most strategic, the thought process is, hey, I'm going to invest this aggressively and I'm not going to touch it for at least 10, 12 years in this case.
Absolutely. And I think you've modeled that here, with a 5% rate of return to signify, hey, it's invested just like your other accounts are.
Yep.
And so it's going to grow at a higher clip. And so what I like about the HSA in general, Amy, is that it also acts as a tactical tool. And so one of the hardest things to model in a spreadsheet like this is, well, when are you going to use it? And because ultimately we'll talk about out-of-pocket medical costs probably in a whole future video. We can talk all day about that. But it's one of the hardest things to plan for in retirement, because you don't know when those shock expenses are going to come. I've had clients that only pay their Medicare premiums, and that's like their only eligible medical expense for a year. And I've had clients that are in a position where, the following year they spent $25,000 on hearing aids. And so, that's a big chunk that could come from the HSA one day, but we don't know exactly when. And so by stockpiling receipts, which we'll talk about as well, is a really important strategy component to this. If you have a lot of receipts and you can redeem at any time, it becomes a tool where if you're in a situation where maybe you want to buy a car and you think it has to come from like a pre-tax account and it's going to balloon up your taxes, it can become a tax-free source to take that money out and smooth your tax liability over time. And so even though in the model we'll often kind of just have a slow drawdown, like I'll tie it to Medicare premiums because I know that's what somebody's going to pay, with a high degree of certainty each year. Really what I'm trying to do is just track, do they have enough time? Like when do they start? If they just do a small amount each year, like what's a reasonable expectation for how long the account will last? But in practice, though, when it actually gets to that stage, we'll often say, hey, maybe in certain years you don't take out any, or maybe you take out a lot, just depending on the circumstances.
Flexibility, I think, is a great thing that this strategy that we're talking about offers. What I did in this case study is what CJ just described. I essentially just mapped out a plan around, mid 70s that this couple starts to pull from their HSA, HSAs. They each do have one. But so what I showed here is, about $10,000 a year. Something CJ just mentioned I want to spend a little time on is he mentioned that Medicare premiums, are an HSA qualified expense, which is true. The key is Part B and D premiums. You cannot pay Medigap or supplemental premiums from an HSA. So those you pay out of pocket if you have, a supplemental policy, but that is not something that you can then reimburse yourself in the future for. That's in general, most medical premiums are not HSA eligible expenses. Medicare Part B premiums is an exception. COBRA premiums, that's an exception. There's a few other exceptions because it wouldn't be, financial planning if there weren't exceptions. But those are some of the big ones. Anything to add there?
No, but just to clarify, IRMA is also included in that too, right? So Part B plus any IRMA that you have.
That is correct.
For accelerated premiums. So like in this case, if you want to scroll up, Amy, to what the actual out-of-pocket costs we're planning on are, we can show exactly what that amount would be in this specific case. And so you see 3 pots, right? There's the out-of-pocket medical. That is kind of what I would consider, I don't want to say a guess, but we tend to be very conservative in how we plan. We know clients aren't going to spend $15,000 per year, each every single year typically. Some do, but most don't. We just know that in certain years you might spend a lot more. And so we want kind of a sinking cost in there spread out throughout the plan, which is why it's, you don't want to necessarily plan on 100% of these costs being redeemable against the HSA every year in your withdrawal strategy.
Yep. I think that's a good point. So and for this case study, at 75, we have this couple, we have potential, medical costs, Part B premiums, supplemental plan premiums, out-of-pocket premiums. We have a total cost of like $35,000 estimated. We're likely, hopefully, overestimating that. But then we just want to have a placeholder in their plan, really as a reminder to say, at some point, we want to start using this HSA money. I'm not sure, CJ, if you wanted to spend any time talking about, when we talk about investing the HSA, like what that looks like. I have some thoughts there. I'll share mine and feel free to jump in. But generally speaking, my recommendation is like a global equity allocation. That's what I usually recommend people use in their HSAs.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different investment philosophies out there. I think the key is to know from a risk tolerance standpoint in general, when do you plan to need that money? Like if you're using your HSA, let's say you're really strapped for cash in an emergency fund and you're the type of person that's like, oh, I've got, 1 month of my expenses in a liquid savings account and I invest everything else. Maybe that HSA becomes kind of a quasi second layer of an emergency fund if you have the receipt to back it up. And so then maybe I wouldn't invest it as aggressively. Or if you are approaching that age where you need to start drawing it down, right? That's another kind of time to revisit and say, hey, maybe we should get a little more tactical. The reality is a lot of people, depending on the provider you have, don't even get to pick a wide array of investments to begin with. And that's a really important consideration with your HSA too. The provider matters a lot. And so, the only time that I recommend that you go with your company's HSA, if you're contributing through your payroll, is if you're getting an employer match. Just because you're HSA eligible does not mean you have to use your employer's payroll to open the account and fund it. And there's not really any advantage in doing so other than it's, simpler because you don't have to make the deposit yourself. But when I'm not getting an employer match or I see a client not getting one, I recommend they go open up an HSA at Fidelity, which at this moment I think has the most flexible offering. A lot of other HSA platforms will require $10,000 or more in cash before you invest the rest. They will sometimes have account fees or limited investment offerings. Fidelity's great because it's as simple as just opening the account. And then we don't even have a relationship with Fidelity, by the way. It's the only account I have with them. But ultimately, it's just really easy to use. And then you can invest on anything on their platform for the most part, right? So any publicly available ETFs and things like that. That matters a lot as well, as not just how do you invest it, but where's it at and where should you contribute to?
Yes, I have seen so many times over the years with people have HSAs with a provider that was set up through their employer, and now they're not employed there any longer. They're retired, and that HSA is charging like a $25 monthly administrative cost to keep it open. It's like, oh yeah, I same as you. I always recommend move it to Fidelity. There's no costs, great investment options. I think it's pretty easy to use their website, so I agree.
So in the context of the plan, Amy, how do you decide when that day is to kind of go, okay, we've taken advantage of this enough from a growth standpoint. Now let's start drawing it down. And why is it so important to plan for the drawdown?
So the drawdown's really important because HSAs are not great assets to leave to a beneficiary other than a spouse. So, we've done videos before talking about Roth IRAs, that Roth IRAs are great assets to kind of leave as the last asset you touch. Let that tax deferral happen, tax-free growth happen as long as possible. Leave that money to your kids or, to your beneficiaries. HSAs are not the same. HSAs, if you leave them to a spouse, your spouse can treat the HSA as their own. So that's great. But if an HSA goes to someone other than a spouse, that whole value of the HSA becomes taxable to the beneficiary in the year they inherit it. And so it can really wipe away all the planning you did, all the strategy that you applied to fund this account, to let it grow tax-free, and then to, theoretically use it for future medical expenses. You throw that out the window if you leave it to someone like a child who, has to pay tax on that whole pot of money when they inherit it.
Yeah, and let me make one clarification there, Amy. So the beneficiaries get a 12-month timeline. So they can, effectively redeem it tax-free for qualified medical expenses. The really challenging part in those situations is that they can only use it for medical expenses incurred in your death, which would mean hospital bills, like kind of in your last moments, right? Or their own. And so unlike, I don't even know if we mentioned this yet, but one of the benefits of keeping receipts is that there is no deadline while you own the HSA to redeem those expenses. So like I just had knee surgery not too long ago. And so I now have a $6,000 bill that I basically have the receipt saved in, an account file storage system. And 15 years from now, I could say I need $6,000 from my HSA and redeem it.
Yep.
30 years from now, I could do that.
Yes.
And so it just becomes a powerful mechanism to just save enough receipts to offset the balance, which we highly recommend you do because it just is going to create more flexibility when you do want to start drawing down. But the only time those expire is when you die. And so the beneficiary of the HSA can't go back through your files and say, 15 years ago, dad had a knee surgery, so I'm going to redeem the HSA.
Yeah.
And so it's not that it's immediately taxable. It's just much harder for them to redeem it when it becomes large.
It is. I've heard of the deathbed drawdown strategy with HSAs where, if you have an HSA and you have a terminal illness or, you're close to the end of life, there's a strategy that says, before you die, make sure you go reimburse yourself for all those HSA receipts that you saved. Sounds great in theory. I think in real life, when someone is at the end of their life, that's really not something they're thinking about. So it's another one of those things. Just proactive planning is helpful to make sure that as the years go on, there is a strategy in place to use, maximize the assets you have and use them to their full extent.
Yeah, and Dana and I were just talking recently about simplification and how important that is as you reach your late 70s and early 80s. And this is one of those cases too. Like we can model, at 78 is the ideal time or 82, but the difference between 75 and 85 in terms of your desire and ability to actually want to employ some kind of tax managed strategy, it changes pretty drastically. And so like what I look at in these models is, okay, when does the HSA, it really, by testing, right, is kind of the game plan. But if it's going to grow at 5% per year, we can start looking at balances. So I'll usually start the drawdown at either age 75 or at $100,000, whatever comes first.
I like that.
That's kind of my general rule of thumb. And in some cases, when I do that and I use kind of the bare minimum, like the Medicare Part B and D premiums, if it doesn't draw down quickly enough, then I will either move the year up or I will recommend clients definitely stockpiling receipts so we can model in a more aggressive withdrawal strategy.
I like that a lot too. And yeah, I think, your initial question that just prompted our mini discussion here was kind of something along the lines of like when to start planning to tap into it and why that's important. But I've also had situations just where someone is progressing through retirement. The HSA is growing. They're not quite at 75, but there's just other things that they want to be spending their money on. I have a couple who just recently treated their whole family to a trip to Disneyland. And it was awesome that they did that. But that took a big chunk of their discretionary spending for the year. And then we talked about, well, hey, you have this HSA. They're in their early 70s. You can use some of it now. There's no harm. It's there. So it's just a flexible tool that needs to be continuously evaluated as how it fits into the overall plan.
So let's assume somebody's been good and they've stockpiled these receipts, Amy, and you have a decision in your mid to late 70s for those one-time expenses between like a Roth IRA withdrawal, which would also be tax-free, or an HSA. Would you prioritize the HSA in that situation?
I probably would. Like most things, it depends. We'd have to look at the facts. But generally speaking, yes, I think it makes more sense to get that money out of the HSA when you can, because the HSA is, again, not something you want to leave to a beneficiary, whereas the Roth IRA doesn't have those same constraints.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting nuance because on the contribution side, will almost favor the HSA in a lot of cases. Like if you have to choose between Roth contributions or HSA, we tend to say do the HSA because it's more flexible early on and throughout. But then on the back end, it's actually the opposite. You want to leave that Roth for your legacy as opposed to the HSA for the reasons we've talked about, if you have a legacy goal.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to talk about too is I prepared a really simple spreadsheet. So we're talking about how important it is to save your medical expenses, to track your medical expenses. So I have this spreadsheet example up here for Dina and Dino. And it's just, there's only a few entries, but it just shows an example of some of the things that you want to keep track of. And so what year did you incur the medical expense? Who incurred the medical expense? What date was the service? What date did you pay the bill? How much was it? Who the provider was, how did you pay it, a description. All of these things are helpful for you to reference in the future. This last column, do you have the receipt on file? You put an X in there if you have the itemized receipt and you've popped it into a folder. CJ and I were talking about this is one way to do it. So you can download this Excel and just keep track of things manually. I know I have lots of clients that use Quicken, that can track things for you. CJ, you mentioned a budgeting app that you use that tracks your medical expenses. And so like most things, there's a lot of different ways you can track. The key is you're tracking them. I find it easiest to do it as it happens, save receipts as they happen, and then as things come up, everything's there when you need it to reimburse yourself, rather than trying to track stuff down 20 years later to reimburse yourself for something.
Right. It's kind of a new age for medical expense tracking. Like back in the day, the reason that your medical providers would say, hey, do you want a receipt? And they encourage you to keep every paper receipt for every $2 prescription or whatever that you pay for. The reason is because of medical expense deduction. Well, in today's tax code, very few people actually use the medical expense deduction. If you do, that's a great reason to keep receipts, every single one.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the HSA, the truth is you don't need every receipt. You really only need the receipts that are going to be enough to offset the balance.
Yeah.
And so, if you go to CVS and buy antihistamine, like Allegra or something for, I don't know how much they cost off the top of my head, but probably too much, call it $20 for a big bottle, right? If you get a $20 expense, but you've got $30,000 of receipts to offset, you don't need to save that $30 paper receipt from CVS.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a waste of time at that point. And so I think to simplify, it's really important to know you don't need all of your receipts. You just need enough to track the balance. And usually the big expenses are enough to do that.
Yeah. Yes, definitely surgeries. Another type of expense I think is worth talking about is, so we talked about how HSAs, you need a high deductible medical insurance plan to have an HSA to fund it. But the expenses that you reimburse yourself from out of your HSA, those don't only have to be medical expenses. You can reimburse yourself for dental expenses, for vision expenses. You and I have these lovely extra glasses, and I think everyone who wears glasses knows they are not inexpensive. And so that's another thing. I just think it's important to talk about that because there's medical, health insurance, and that's always separate from dental and vision insurance. But dental and vision expenses are qualified expenses for the purpose of HSA.
Oh, and it's getting expanded more and more. Like every tax bill that they pass to do any kind of HSA modification, usually it's going to expand what's available as an option. I'm wearing this Aura ring right now, and even that is HSA eligible.
Yeah.
And so a lot of fitness, supplies and things like that are becoming HSA eligible too. Even if you go to Amazon, it will state very clearly, can you redeem it against your HSA? Now, with your provider, when you're actually doing that, you have a couple of options depending on, what provider you're choosing. You can actually have like an HSA card and scan it against that. I'm a big credit card point guy. So what I prefer to do, because you end up ahead financially, is put it on the credit card of your choice. It's going to give you cash back or, some kind of mileage or something.
Yep.
And then just submit the receipt to your HSA provider and they will send the cash directly to your checking account. I tend to think that's the best way to do it. But some people like to simplify and just have their own HSA card.
Yep. So yes, I agree with all of that. I love credit card points. It's a whole other video too. But I would say in general, I think really the key points that I wanted to make sure we talked about today, I think we touched on all of them. But what are HSAs? Who's eligible to fund them? How do they fit into an overall retirement decumulation drawdown plan? How should you invest them? What are some of the nuances? I think we talked about most of that.
Great. There's one other area that I wanted to ask you about, which is, we keep talking about having expenses to offset, like the receipts.
Yep.
But what about people that don't? What are the ramifications if, you had them all in a box and you lost that box and now you need $50,000 from an HSA?
So I think that there's 2 points I'll make there. One is hopefully you had a spreadsheet. You had something where you were tracking the expenses. Theoretically, if you have the list of the expenses you were tracking, you could reach out to those providers and get copies of those receipts. The second piece of this is, you're supposed to have the receipts in case you're audited. That's the key. If you can verify those expenses, if you have them tracked somewhere else, I think you're still safe. I don't know if that's the proper answer.
Well, yeah. And so that's practical. But in terms of like the regulation, the withdrawal is subject to income tax plus a 20% penalty, except for one really important caveat, which is when you turn 65, you just pay the income tax. So the penalty goes away. That basically turns it into a traditional IRA.
Yes.
And so now instead of having the triple tax benefit, you're still getting the first 2 tranches of tax benefit.
Yes.
You still get the deduction and you still get the tax deferred growth. You just can't take it out tax free unless it's for this specified purpose.
Yeah.
And so again, it's not even like the old 529 plan issue where, you funded an account with way too much money and you don't have the expenses and now, you're kind of trapped without penalty. There is a very reasonable out to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had a client once ask me about that. Can I treat it like an IRA? And I was like, can you? And of course you can. But I questioned it because we almost never recommend doing that.
Yeah, well, right. And,
yeah.
and practically, like, you're going to have medical expenses in retirement.
Right.
So if you can be a little patient, you're going to accrue them over time. And so it's always better to not pay the income tax. Like, you end up way behind. But if you're in a pinch, it's still important for people to know that it is an option in like a worst case scenario.
It is, yeah. And I think there's definitely circumstances where somebody maybe has an HSA with money in it, but no IRA or no other bucket of money to pull from. And yes, at 65, they can treat it like a traditional IRA. I'm glad you brought that up, CJ.
I think that puts a wrap on our conversation today. So we helped you make sense of HSAs, and please stay tuned for more case studies in the future.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Making Retirement Make Sense. If you found it helpful, please like, subscribe, comment, and share it with someone who you feel could benefit from what we discussed today. And if you're feeling extra generous, we'd welcome a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.